Well, I'm sorry to interrupt what I'm sure must be a very pleasant evening. It's a great pleasure to see you all, to talk to some of you, and to be able to organize this so that we get together and we have a chance to compare notes and become friends again, and even better friends. So let me just say a few words before I introduce the speaker for tonight. Let me just remind you that maybe some of you don't know that PEPM is an enterprise that began in the Department of Economics at Columbia with the contribution of both Columbia School of Business and its current home, the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Now that happened 20 years ago, and from then I was trying to think, all the problems that the world has gone through, which are relevant for what PEPM is about. So if you start from the beginning, you see that the problems there were good. The kinds of problems that you want to have. There was how to manage the peace boom after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And now here we are, 20 years after, and we are trying to keep track of what's happening in Europe and learn how to help emerging markets, which so far they're doing very well, but partly as a reflection that in the North they are not doing that well. So that's good news for the South, but still it's a risky situation. The PEPM has been inspired by that, and the emphasis has always been global. So we are very happy, have enjoyed, and we think that there is a mission for PEPM, and some of that mission has been accomplished. But we don't feel that we have reached our pinnacle. Actually, we feel that we sort of went the first step, and now there is a big step ahead of us, which when I look at this room and all the friends that we have around the world, when you think that this PEPM has trained around 1,000 students that are around the world, that have many of them outstanding positions around the world, where we all are facing similar problems and we can enrich each other by exchanging ideas, you realize immediately that there is a potential there for better networking. So that is a word that I brought up, or concept that I brought up yesterday when we started these meetings, and I'd like to reiterate that for us that is a very important project. And we are thinking about, we are already doing something about that. We have a program with IDB, for example, an executive program. We can do that and replicate it in other parts of the world. We have, the faculty here at Columbia is a unique group of people who are not only top academics, but many of them are being heavily involved in economic policy. So there's a lot that this university can give, and sometimes it's just a matter of getting our house in order, getting our act together, as they say. And the other thing that we are thinking these days is about offshoring, if you wish, the training program space at PEPM. We can do it here. We've been doing it here, but there's a potential for doing it outside. Well, I can go on and on PEPM, but that's something that I wanted to leave with you, because certainly I think it's a great idea to network, but we cannot do it by ourselves. We are working on that. David is doing in a very creative way. He's looking around and trying to locate all of our graduates, and he has succeeded a great deal already, but there is work outside. So please feel that this is also your project. and we are going to do our best to be your good partners. Let me say a few words, because everybody is anxious to hear our speaker tonight, about funders and early faculty and supporters. Some of that came up this afternoon. Ron Findlay, who's been around this program from the very beginning, he gave us an overview of the founders and some of the early supporters. Let me remind you again that a very big player, I was not here, but I've been told that really worked very hard to get this going, was Professor David Bloom, who is currently at Harvard, and at the time was the head of the economics department. We contacted David. It would have been great if he showed up. He had another commitment on the West Coast, actually, but he sent me a very long and warm letter, and he asked me to communicate to you to send you his best regards. Since we have several of our founders and early faculty here, I'd like to recognize them. Unfortunately, well, you saw Michael Gavin today. He was not able to join us tonight. He was a strong supporter of PEPM together with David Bloom. And this was recognized today, fortunately, when he was around with us, and served as the PEPM's first director from 1992 to 1994. Then Danny Roderick with us here. We're very happy to have him joining us. Richard Clarida, Ron Findlay. They were early faculty and supporters. And as was Bill Easterly in the mid-90s. He was supposed to be with us. He had a little problem at home and could not show up. In the room, we have my friend Michael Connolly, who was, he's now, good. He's very shy. University of Miami. He directed PEPM through 1994-95. And in 1996 began the era of Francisco Rivera Batiz. Francisco, please stand up. He had a long reign until 2002, followed by Arvid Lukauskas. Where are you? Who took the key through early 2007, and then it was my turn. Thank you. Okay, I could go on and on, but let me turn now a little bit about the institutions. Strong support from institutions, undoubtedly. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Japanese Ministry of Finance and the World Bank for having the insight and the will to put into motion a program that has changed so many lives. And I truly say that because not only do we have sister programs here in the United States, but now there are sister programs in several cities in Africa, in France, and in Japan. And our colleagues at the World Bank continue to work with us and our students on an annual basis. We thank them very dearly. Without their support, we would surely falter. And that brought me to mind that this is a bit like the gods in the Rheingold without Freya, who was the goddess of youth. So here we are. I mean, you don't know how much that means to me. I'm a Wagnerian, so I can explain the details, but this means really something. Without Freya, you couldn't survive. Impossible. And without the World Bank, same problem. So thank you so much. Also would like to thank SIPA, School of International Public Affairs, for providing a home for PEPM and its constant support. And now let me end recognizing some of people who played a really key role in the administration, the running, if you wish, of PEPM. Here we have Cecilia Barcelos, please, stand up. Was assistant, was the first assistant directors, executive directors, followed by Maya Haddow. And I believe we have here now Deborah Wilson, is that right? No, she's not, didn't show up. Well, sorry, she was administrative assistant. And last but not least, I really want to thank David, Coughlin, and Samantha. Yeah, he must have a knack to being popular, which I have to learn from him. So they really worked very hard for this to be a success, which I really think myself it is. So thank you so much. You don't know how lucky you've been to have them organize this. If I was in charge, you would be eating at McDonald's at this point. So, well, thank you to all. Let me join me thanking everybody that supported PEPM over the years. Okay, now we'll change gears and move on to the icing on the cake. Our good old friend Danny Roderick. He needs no introduction, and that's why he's going to get one. So he's now the Rafik Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. I will summarize some of his achievements because I don't want to take a lot of time. He was PEPM's, one of the first faculty members at PEPM, and his areas of expertise are mostly international economics, economic development, and political economy. He has been awarded many prizes, as you would imagine. He got the inaugural Albert Hirschman Prize of the Social Science Research Council in 2007. He has received the Leontiev Award for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. And he got honorary doctorates from the University of Antwerp and Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú and several other recognitions. Let me just, of course, he has many, many papers in top journals, as you would expect, and must have read. And let me say that his 1997 book, Has Globalization Gone Too Far?, was called one of the most important economic books of the decade in Business Week. And he has other books, but he has a most recent book, The Globalization Paradox, which was published in 2011. He has a PhD and MPA from Princeton and a bachelor from Harvard College. Danny is a speaker that you can agree or disagree with him, but you certainly will never remain indifferent. So we are looking forward to hear his talk. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. It's really a big honor to be here. When Guillermo asked me to come and do this, I jumped at the chance. because I've always had a soft spot, not just for Columbia, but for PEPM. PEPM, which I'm very proud to have been one of the early faculty members in, is really one of the new wave of programs in development based in rigorous methods that started a couple of decades ago, and PEPM was really at the forefront of those programs. And when I subsequently left for Harvard, we've built a program there which tries to follow in very much the same kind of footsteps. So it's really wonderful to see this program having come such a long way and be doing so well. And one part of me will always be with PEPM. So I congratulate everybody whose involvement has made this possible. And it's great to see the program doing so well and thriving. I'm going to be talking about some recent developments in economic development, and my title is How Should We Do Development? The field of economic development and development policy has really changed a whole lot in the last 20 years. And what I'm going to argue is that it's changed mostly for the better. But I'm going to be putting a somewhat unusual and perhaps personal interpretation on what are the important changes. And even though the field seems to be fairly divided between a macro orientation in terms of economy-wide reforms and a very micro project-based orientation revolving largely around field experiments and randomized controlled trials. I'm actually going to argue that there is a unifying theme, a unifying way of doing development that very much combines the best of both of those two traditions. One way to start this discussion is by sort of this competition we've had just very recently in terms of who should be running the World Bank. Of course, we really know who should have been running the World Bank. But ultimately, it came down to these two. And what's interesting is that Jim Kim and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala represented two very, very different ways of thinking about development, two very different traditions of doing development. And one wishes that we would have had a real debate about these two perspectives. And of course, we never got that because it was foreordained that the American candidate would be appointed. But we almost got a debate, and I think the differences between these two perspectives is a nice way for me to frame my discussion, because these two individuals represent two very different visions. Dr. Jim Kim's work had been in the area of health and in health projects around the developing world, particularly in tuberculosis. And it's very much a bottom-up kind of a project. If you will, it's sort of a one project at a time kind of an approach. It focuses very much on microeconomics and social policy. Its emphasis on education programs, health programs, microcredit, service delivery to the poor. And if you were working in this kind of a tradition, you would think of what's a major development success. Well, major development success would be like a program, Progresa, and then sort of its various successors in Mexico would be viewed as a major. And sort of your ideal job, if you're coming from this tradition, would be to run an NGO. And your heroes would be people like Mohamed Yunus, who started Grameen Bank, or El Abad from the well-known self-employed women's association in India. It's a very different tradition from a tradition that Ngozi represented, which focuses on sort of, the big levers, doing economy-wide policy reforms, focusing on macro, the big picture, economic growth, with emphasis on trade policy and fiscal policy, financial policies, industrial and regulatory policies, and governance at the national level. The big success of this vision would be China's economics reforms in 1978, and I'll come back to that in a second. If you're coming out from this tradition, your ideal job would be to be running the finance ministry, the most important economics ministry in the country. And your heroes would be Manmohan Singh, who led the Indian reforms in 1991 and eventually became prime minister, as we know, and Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who had a very similar trajectory in Brazil. Now, without question, of course, you can do good things and you can succeed with both kinds of visions, with both kinds of responsibilities. But suppose we ask the question, if you had sort of, any kind of a job and you really want to do we really wanted to have the biggest impact on economic development, which type of levers, which type of positions would give you the best chance of making the biggest difference? If I pose the question that way, in terms of the greatest impact, I would argue that, in fact, the second approach, focusing on economy-wide reforms, would seem to be the clear winners. And I think the case in point would be China. China, as you know, has experienced the greatest poverty reduction that the world has ever seen, something like around 650 million fewer people over the period of a quarter century below the extreme poverty line of $1 a day since the early 1980s. This is a remarkable achievement, especially given that the population was growing of China at the same time. In fact, as you can see from these numbers, well, there are too many numbers here, so let me just state it, that if you look at the world as a whole, the developing world as a whole, that China accounts for the entire reduction in the number of absolute poor since the early 1980s. And why? Well, largely because of a very rapid increase in economic growth since the late 1970s, and largely because of a series of fairly large-scale economic reforms, whether it was reforming the agricultural system, reforming property rights, reforming urban industries, reforming the trade regime, the kinds of things that you associate with national economic management, rather than that you think about in terms of sort of health projects or education projects or delivery of social services for the poor. Now, it's entirely possible that China had a basis in terms of initial investments in human capital that made these economic reforms more productive subsequently. But I think you would have to say that the primary credit for this significant reduction in poverty belongs to economy-wide reforms. So from this perspective, you might be tempted to say that of these two different visions, the one that says work with the big levers is the one that might have the greatest impact. But not so fast. The problem is that what we actually do learn from China in terms of the types of levers that actually work in terms of producing economic growth, in terms of producing poverty reduction, do not travel really all that well. So the specific policies, the specific levers that actually worked are not entirely clear. There's still an ongoing discussion in terms of how to interpret China's experience. Was it the consequence of a turn towards market and liberalization, in the sense that if in fact China had liberalized more, they would have been more successful? Or was it, in fact, that even though they did turn towards markets, they did it in a rather managed, sequential, gradual way, with the state remaining very much in charge, and with state direction of economic activity and industrial transformation still a very big part of the picture. So that it was really this combination rather than simply a turn towards markets. And so we actually do not learn very specific lessons about what policies we can take to other countries just by studying the Chinese case. And when you turn to the literature that tries to generate broad lessons about these kinds of economy-wide levers, the kinds of things that finance ministers and trade ministers do, it turns out that that literature isn't very helpful, because that literature vacillates between arriving at specific policy recommendations that, when you scratch the data a little bit more, actually finds very limited support in cross-country evidence, or coming up with very broad recommendations that end up really having very, very little operational content. So that if you want to interpret the broad international experience as saying that, you know, outward orientation and insertion and joining the global economy, providing property rights and contract enforcement, and achieving macroeconomic stability are important, yes, absolutely. But of course, these are such broad lessons that they say very little about what the specific levers are in terms of how specifically you achieve integration into the world economy. And if you try to make that very specific by saying, well, the best way to achieve is by reducing your tariffs to 10% and making them uniform, well, it turns out that that's not, that a lot of countries have done that and haven't really benefited, or that the experience has been highly heterogeneous. So the specific levers, this information that we get from specific levers that would provide policy guidance for our ministers of finance is actually not really there. So in principle, if you succeed, economy-wide reforms can get you a whole lot, but it's not entirely clear we know what they are. And so you might say, well, might as well work with specific projects that you can achieve something if you don't know a whole lot about how to do reform at the macro level. I think there are a number of respects in which the other perspective, in turn, falls short. Let me list a number of those things. One is that it's important not to lose sight of the distinction between development policy proper and what might be called humanitarian assistance. Because treating the symptoms of poverty is not the same as treating the causes. So poor people have very little education, don't have access to health services, don't have access to roads and transport, and a whole host of other syndromes of poverty. You can try to treat those syndromes by, for example, providing them better access to education and health services, but it's not entirely clear that that's going to generate economic development unless those particular failings are in fact the causal reasons. So people might not have access to health or education because they're poor, because they don't have income generating opportunities, and that the fundamental cause might be the lack of those income generating opportunities rather than low human capital. And historically, in terms of what has achieved economic development, we know that poverty has been addressed in countries that are achieving economic transformation, not necessarily by helping poor people be better at the things that they're already doing, but actually getting them to do things that are different from what they're already doing. So it's not necessarily making them more productive producing the kinds of things at subsistence agriculture or other things that they're doing, but actually getting them to do some things that are altogether different by achieving productive diversification, by getting them to produce non-traditional products, by getting them into urban areas, by achieving industrialization. And to the extent that that is true, then somewhat paradoxically, the best way to achieve poverty reduction might be to pull levers, undertake interventions that are actually quite a lot distant from the poor. Not necessarily where the poor live, but actually maybe in urban areas or in economy-wide reforms. It might be that bad regulation, very distant from the poor, or an overvalued exchange rate is really the fundamental cause of underdevelopment, because with bad regulation, say, or with an undervalued currency, entrepreneurs and the private sector don't have sufficient incentives to invest in the kinds of new industrial enterprises that can in turn absorb the surplus labor from the traditional rural parts of the country. And furthermore, there are, of course, limits to how much we learn from individual projects. Two sorts of limits. One is the problems of scaling up. Often individual projects can work very well, both because there's a lot of monitoring, a lot of investment in actual effort that is spent on making sure that individual projects work, and that's not going to scale up. And also because you can spend a lot on making sure that individual projects work, but you're not going to be able to spend nearly as much if you're going to be scaling up. And of course, the question about external validity, which is very important with respect to field experiments or randomized controlled trials, is the question of whether if a particular project, let's say, works in Western Kenya, will it also work in Ethiopia? If the context is very different, even though you're able to ascertain fairly closely whether something works or not in a particular setting. That's, in fact, the advantage of RCTs. It's not entirely clear that you can take that message and apply it to other settings. So far, this is pretty depressing, right? I mean, I've said that the macro types, if actually they can succeed, they can achieve a whole lot. But we actually don't know really what they know. And then the microtypes, well, when you think about it, they have a very partial take, and often they may not be operating on the real levers of development. But here is where I want to turn positive, and I want to argue that, in fact, there is a positive message that we can take from the turn that both the macro literature and the micro literature in development has taken, which is a convergence towards not a set of policies that work regardless of context, but a particular way of thinking about how you think about which levers to pull, depending on context. So it's a convergence about how one thinks about and does development policy, not a convergence on what works. So if we abstract from differences in the level of analysis, that is micro versus macro, and in the empirical methods focus on RCTs versus more econometric methods, then in fact the most recent work in these two traditions in development share a common predicament, a common predilection towards a diagnostic approach, a pragmatic approach, an experimental approach that tries to identify context-specific strategies. And that's really the key thing that I think is novel, the thing that unifies these two. To sort of draw this distinction about what is in fact new, it's helpful to understand how exactly this differs from the presumptive, traditional way of doing development. Because the presumptive approach to development typically revolves around the big idea that development is universally held back by too little government, and therefore you need planning, or too much government, therefore you need the Washington Consensus, too little credit, therefore you need microcredit, or absence of property rights, and therefore you need, De Soto telling you that you should give everybody a piece of paper that gives them title to property rights. So the presumptive way really comes with a big fix, whether that big fix is central planning or it's the import substituting industrialization model, whether it's the Washington consensus, whether it's the new governance agenda, whether it's a big push, and in the micro sphere, whether it's a focus on public health, it's a focus on microfinance, or it's a focus on property rights. What's common in these presumptive approaches is that basically there is a single fix because there is the presumption that there is a single universal thing that's holding back development. And if you just focus on that, then you'll be okay. And along with that comes with a bias towards universal recipes, universal solutions, an attempt to think in terms of best practices. So if you could just have a best practice for governance reform, a best practice for trade reform, best practice in conditional cash transfers and so forth, these are the things that you're going to be doing around the world. This new approach towards which I think there is this methodological convergence is much more diagnostic. It starts with a degree of agnosticism. It says we do not know ex ante what works and what doesn't. So we do not start from a presumption that we know that it's too little government or too much government, that it's really credit markets that are failing, or is that human capital that is the constraint. So what you need to do is look for constraints, look for the binding constraints or the major obstacles in a context-specific way. And because you don't know, you need to experiment. You need to try different things. And because you're not going to be right, that's in the very nature of experimentation, then you have to think of development in a process-oriented way where you're monitoring and evaluating on an ongoing basis what it is that you're doing, so that there's a feedback loop that can be closed, whether the things that you're trying out are working or not, if they're not working, so you can revise them. With this focus, because you are trying to identify the things that are really, really important in a particular context, whether it's education interventions, or whether it's tax reform, or whether it's dealing with red tape, then this approach says that you can actually afford to focus on a relatively narrow, selectively targeted kinds of reforms, because that's really where you're going to get a big bang initially. And therefore, you don't need this laundry list. You can do much narrower range of reforms. And the idea here is that by virtue of being poor, by virtue of being developing and very far from the frontier, in fact, your economy has a lot of slack. And therefore, well-targeted reforms selected appropriately can produce a big bang. And therefore, also with this approach, you tend to have a certain amount of suspicion towards universal remedies or best practices. And the approach tends to rely very heavily on policy innovations that are going to unlock local second best or political complications. Now, in the macro sphere, the work that has been going on, that I've been doing along with others on diagnostic, growth diagnostics or work on binding constraints, of course, is built very much on these kinds of ideas. But what I'm also saying is that the micro work, particularly on RCTs, field experiments, when you try to extract a certain strategy of how those experiments are selected and how, what is the logic behind them, that in fact turns out to be not all that different, because it's the same kind of logic. That is the logic of trying to figure out what works in a particular setting and being relatively agnostic about the solutions ex ante. The litmus test, I think, that differentiates the presumptive approach from the diagnostic approach is the answer to this question. Do you believe there is an unconditional and unambiguous mapping from specific policies to economic outcomes? If the answer is yes, you're in the presumptive camp. If no, then I think you have to rely on certain kind of diagnostic strategy. And I think that's what I'm arguing, is that increasingly, in fact, both in the macro and the micro, both in the sort of the social service delivery public health, education kind of projects. And in the more macro sphere, we're moving in the direction of this more diagnostic approach. China, of course, going back, has been the great success of this experimental approach. In fact, what's striking in China's economic policies is how many of their economic policies were explicitly stamped experimental. In other words, things that were going to be tried out. And of course, China's experience in experimentation, this sort of pragmatic experimental mode of reform that China carried out, also tells us that you don't have to be doing RCTs in order to learn from experimentation. It's not that China actually did randomized field experiments in order to learn from its policy experiments. But by the same token, it would be silly to say that China didn't learn anything from its experiments simply because they weren't undertaken in a randomized, controlled fashion. In fact, I think the claims that randomized controlled trials represent something that is the claims about the supremacy of RCTs, I think, exaggerate the differences between micro and macro. And the main issue here is really the distinction between internal validity and external validity. RCTs are, of course, very good at internal validity. But when we do these experiments, we also want to learn about what they mean for policy elsewhere. And the moment you try to carry the policy implications of a particular experiment to other settings, then you are extrapolating. You're adding soft evidence on top of hard evidence in a way that's going to make the ultimate policy conclusion as soft as the kind of evidence that you end up getting from other kinds of empirical techniques. Usable evidence from RCTs, that is usable in other settings, in general settings, are in that sense as contestable as evidence that we get from other kinds of techniques that, for example, macro types use. So the empirical inference challenges that micro specialists face, I don't think are greatly different from those of a macro type. So again, there's less difference, I think, than meets the eye. So let me just stop by saying that I see in these trends, in the way that both the macro economy-wide focus, the way that those people have been looking at development policy and the more micro-oriented people are looking at development, I think represents a certain amount of convergence. And I think to complete the convergence in some way, we need also a bit of a change in mindset of the two types, that we need more of the people who are thinking in terms of economy-wide reforms and macro policy to understand that they have to adopt the more pragmatic, experimental mindset of the micro people, and for them to understand, in fact, that they know a lot less than sometimes they will tell you. And correspondingly, that the micro people, the people who do the experiments, the real experiments, the randomized experiments, for them to really understand that, in fact, they can learn a whole lot less than they actually think they can, simply for these problems of extrapolation. But I think with that, that we really are joined in some way. It's a convergence away from listing a set of policies that every country ought to adopt, but it's a movement towards a different and new and I think much more productive way of thinking about how you do development in local settings, regardless of whether you're working for specific projects or you're doing the work at the economy-wide level. And that kind of habit of thought, that kind of discipline, I think, works across the field, both in social policy, in growth policy, and also, I think, in terms of governance reforms and bureaucratic reforms as well. And that's where I see a lot of interesting work happening across the board. Let me just stop here. I'm happy to take some comments and questions on this, but I did want to share with you what I think is in fact an exciting convergence, something that we ought to be feeling good about, although often it seems like the profession is really divided between these two kinds of traditions. I think there is more commonality actually than meets the eye. Yes.
You've made a wonderful speech and discussion of this issue and present a very balanced picture. And so I think in some ways, though, it's a little too balanced. That maybe more could be said about the macro side than to say that the macro side, whatever you do, macroeconomic stability is has no operational significance. I think one of the great things that one notices about growth in the last half century is the spectacular development of the Asian economies, of course, the tigers, and China in particular. And I think all those economies had paid a lot of attention to macroeconomic stability, and it was quite well defined. Now, China had a period after 1978 of sequential inflation, devaluation, et cetera, et cetera. The last one was in 1994. But then a change started. In 1995, China had they issued their study on macroeconomic stability. They call it monetary stability. And they went around the world, looked at large, significant countries, and came up with the conclusion that monetary stability could be defined in terms of either exchange rate stability or in terms of price level stability. And they fudged. They didn't make a decision on that issue. And ever since, so 1995, the history of China has been a mixture, a little bit of both. But one thing is quite clear is that after 1997, when the exchange rate was fixed at 8.28, China had a better record on price stability than any G7 country. Throughout this whole period, a much better record on price stability than any G7 country. And it did that with fixed exchange rates up to 2005, then a period of about average 5% a year appreciation until 2008, and then in the 2008, when the dollar was soaring and the RMB was soaring, then they stopped appreciating against the dollar, and then they went back, and now they've changed it again and got back to the. But to me, that's very operational. They've had wonderful macroeconomic stability, and people think in monetary stability, they would say, monetary stability isn't everything, but without it, you don't have anything, because there's no economic. The great advantage for China of stabilizing the dollar, I had organized a conference with the PBC in 1995, when I was in China this period, with the IMF and the Deutsche Bank and Citibank, and the clear-cut consensus was that a fixed exchange rate policy at that time, with China's history of inflation, was the best thing, and let that be the monetary policy of China. And that worked extraordinarily well for China. And then they were pushed into appreciation, and that worked out well too, slow appreciation. But throughout the whole period, they had a wonderful mixture of both exchange rate stability and monetary stability. And I think that became, along with, of course, all the other things that were good for China, which is the principle that, first of all, they went for the absolute top technology they could get or buy in the world and import that, of foreign direct investment and export-led growth. And that was, to a large extent, the pattern also of the Asian tigers, and it was, I think, very successful. If you look at the Asian crisis period, you look at those economies that were struck by it most severely, like Thailand and Indonesia, and let's say Malaysia and Korea. Each of those countries had no clear-cut monetary target. But the other countries like Thailand and Hong Kong and China and Japan had no great flack from the Asian crisis. They accepted it because they had a clear-cut goal of money. Each one had a different system of macroeconomic stability. Singapore's was different from Hong Kong's and China's and so on. But they all survived very, very successfully. So I think that the macroeconomic stability is, I don't see that should be any great controversy over that, because no country has succeeded in any really long-run successful growth period without macroeconomic stability.
No, I mean, Bob, I think you're absolutely right. And first, let me say that it's been a while since somebody has called me too balanced, so I appreciate that comment. My point was that I agree precisely with what you've said, which is that macroeconomic stability is the sine qua non of successful economic development. If you do not get that in place, it's very hard to imagine that, in fact, you're going to get any growth and development going. But as you also indicate, the manner in which that macroeconomic stability framework was implemented, even within East Asia, differs significantly across different countries, all the way from the currency board regime of Hong Kong to the more managed exchange rate regimes. And China's, sort of monetary policy exchange rate regime is something that's, along with its sort of capital controls, is something that's going to be very hard for other countries to precisely emulate. So my point was precisely to say that we can make generalizations at the level such as macroeconomic stability is absolutely critical. And we can do that the moment we can get off the plane, any country that we know nothing about. And when they say, okay, what's important? We can say macroeconomic stability is important, rule of law is important, property rights protection is important, right? We can say that we don't knowing anything about the country that we're in. But that doesn't actually provide a whole lot of specific guidance to policymakers, because the question is, how are you going to get that? So are you going to have a fixed exchange rate? If it's going to be a fixed exchange, is it going to be a currency board? Are you going to dollarize? You're going to have a managed exchange rate? If you're going to be floating, if it's going to be floating, are you going to be running an inflation targeting regime? Are you going to be controlling monetary aggregates? What's going to be your capital account regime? So these are all things that will depend, depending on the context. And the point was that it's very difficult to make context-free generalizations about which one of these combinations work best to produce the ultimate target which all successful countries need to have, which is monetary or macroeconomic stability. And that's where we have a lot of heterogeneity.
Let me have one moment. One little comment, yes. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, and I agree with that. But the only thing is I would say that now in this world, you can't talk about any country having a fixed exchange rate when the two big currency areas in the world, the dollar and euro, are going up and down like that. So fixed exchange rates is not possible for any country.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like you to... it's very hard to disagree with the general principle, but I'd like for you to help us go into the details of this. How does it work? Because it sounds very scientific. I go to a country, I begin to experiment. But I know that experimentation, I have to deal with the politicians, what they want to experiment with, what not. Most likely I will fall into the hands of some very powerful guys who say, don't touch me, touch them. And also experimentation is something that sounds great, but on the other hand, there is a poor private citizen sitting and looking up at the government and decided, oh, these guys are experimenting, so will I invest or not? Where? If it doesn't work, they will turn around and say, no, we'll do something different. So that's why I guess I see some value, maybe a lot of value, on rules which are not going to be super optimal rules, but very clear-cut rules. And then after a while, I agree that some experimentation on those rules, but I'd like you to help us understand to what extent this experimentation will go.
Yeah, I mean, I think, experimentation doesn't mean that you're actually sort of, running experiments on your population, and then sort of every day there's a randomizing on the tax regime that every month there is a different tax rate or that different country. So you can certainly do it in a way that, as you suggest, that it's going to throw out so much uncertainty. I think what it means, and I think its application for different types of policy levers are going to be very different. Its application is essentially just having a sense of pragmatism about what might work or might not work, and not necessarily starting off with a presumption that the latest fad in development or the latest or sort of whatever worked in the neighboring country is going to work. So it's more a reflection of how you're trying to solve your problems. That is, it's going to be more of a problem-driven approach, that you're trying to identify what the most important obstacles to the problem that you're facing in a particular domain is, whether it's the fiscal regime or it's the property rights regime. And a lot of the experimentation is actually precisely to get around political problems. For example, a lot of the experimentation in China was to take into account that the standard forms of property rights reform wouldn't work in a regime where the local governments could expropriate private investors at will, and the local courts were going to be too weak, and therefore, instead of having, sort of simply importing private property rights as in a Western system, you do it through a regime that's a mixed property rights regime where you're basically buying in the cooperation of local governments by making them effectively the residual owners. So it gets around a particular political constraint that you had. And it wasn't because somebody at the top decided that this is how it was going to be. It was simply by observing that this seemed to be working okay. So it needs to be something that is to be encouraged. Now there are areas of policy where I think it's very difficult to imagine how you can be experimental. Your exchange rate regime. Right? It's very difficult to imagine that you're going to be experimenting on your exchange rate regime. So don't take what I'm saying this to be that. But you can experiment, I think, over for example, your capital account, your capital flows. Something doesn't work, you try something else if you have a good sense of what is it that you're trying to do. So certain areas of regulatory prudential policy are going to be more possible to experiment than in others, such as your currency regime. In your trade and industrial policies, particularly industrial policy, I think there's a lot of room to be experimental, because every country provides opportunities for doing different things in different parts of the government, different parts of the country. Many governments actually have federal structures, and the federal structures or the municipal structure allows a laboratory for different regional leaders to be doing different things. A lot of the industrial policy in India, for example, is actually taking place at the state level. And it's done in a very experimental way because there are different chief ministers trying to do different things, regardless of what the national government is. So yes, I mean, if you do this, in a way that just reifies experimentation, then you're going to end up with just total unpredictability and chaos. that's not what is meant. I think that the idea is to bear in mind that in a lot of areas of policy where there's actually room to be trying different things and then monitoring and evaluating and changing them, that kind of pragmatic outlook may be more encouraging to the private sector. And let me just give this as an example. I think one of the, as a final example, if you look at the rules in Asia with respect to the private sector, the whole private sector rule and legal environment in East Asia, and China, of course, is a great example of that, is much less rule-based than in Latin America today, for example, because in Latin America it has gone in the direction of trying to have explicit rules in a lot of different areas. But then, the surprising thing is that, many private investors feel much more at home in the East Asian environment because they know that they're dealing with a public sector that's going to try to accommodate them. Whereas the usual answer in a well-governed Latin American country will be, keep them at arm's length. Here are the rules. We don't change the rules for anybody. We have common rules, common ground rules for everybody. Well, if those rules were ideal and well-suited for everybody, then that would be great. But I think, what we've learned from East Asia is that, having public managers and public regulators and public policy officials who are actually willing to talk to the private sectors, address their needs, make the changes in rules and regulations when need be, I think makes for a policy regime that is a lot more variable ex post, but I think in some sense in ex ante may give more investment incentives for the private sector because you feel that you have a government that is actually listening to you. So, in that way, you might have the paradox that the set of rules that are much more informal might be more conducive to private investment than a set of rules that are simply just taken, written in stone.
We have time for more questions.
Thank you very much. Mine is a somewhat more flippant question. I wonder whether you think Kim's background in health will make him lean more towards a diagnostic approach.
I think a flippant answer to the flippant question. I think the fact that he's not an economist will definitely incline him in that direction, and I think that's good. I think the silliest argument, frankly, that was made against him was that he was not an economist. And I think that makes no sense. I mean, the problem, of course, is that the World Bank is dominated by economists, and is going to have, only, so many enough economists, around him that the question is whether, he will be able to, he will be overwhelmed, or whether he's going to be, running with his own instincts. So, I think that sense of pragmatism, and as well as deep-seated knowledge about on-the-ground realities of development, I think that's a great advantage, and he comes with that feel, which not many previous World Bank presidents had. So I think that's a great advantage. And any deficiency you may have in technical economic expertise, there's certainly enough economists in the World Bank around him that he will have a lot of support in that way. So I think, yes, I think broadly speaking, my answer would be yes.
Last question for Ernesto.
Danny, I just wanted to try to understand how you reconcile the experimentation, innovation aspect with the, let's say, more macro incentive-oriented aspect. And this is just to focus it on one theme, education for quality of education in critical contexts. We've seen many different models that work. There's no one size fits all. So that would be a field in which experimentation and innovation would be potentially very fruitful. At the same time, in order for experimentation and innovation to actually be vibrant, you need a set of incentives that have to do with the overall education policy that would allow for experimentation and innovation to go on, which in many cases, perhaps I'm looking at the example of Latin America, but you have very centralized regimes which would not allow for experimentation and innovation. So sometimes you have to have a rules-based macro policies that would actually create the incentives in order to produce the necessary critical mass of experimentation and innovation. So it's not one or the other, it is both. You need one to get the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely need at the national level an environment that's going to foster innovation at the subnational level, right? So that's what you need. So you need for the experimenters to know that they can reap the benefits of their experimentation if they get it right. So that happens either because you are in an explicitly federal system, so that the local governments have sufficient autonomy that they can reap the rewards, or if it's a unitary system, then, as you suggest, you need the national authority to provide an enabling environment for subnational units to be willing to do that. Now, and so you might say that that's a rule-based regime. Yes, of course. But it's got to be a rule-based regime that's going to provide flexibility for subnational units to be doing different things. I think it's interesting, again, I'm not a Latin American specialist, but it seemed to me one of the striking things going around Latin America in the 1990s was how much experimentation there was going on at the city level, at the municipal level in Latin America, dealing with urban problems, public transport, crime, sort of the standard urban problems, compared to economic policy. Economic policy all came from the Washington Consensus Rulebook, more or less. But at the municipal level, in fact, there was a lot of experimentation going on in terms of trying to address with these urban problems in ways that were very different. And that was quite good. There was a lot of urban successes that was achieved. And I always said that one of what enabled that was that in fact there was no Washington consensus for how do you run an urban municipality. There was a Washington consensus for national economic policy, but no Washington consensus for municipal policy, and that set them free. They said there was no answer that came down pat from sort of the technocrats or the Washington. So you had to look for problems and solve them yourself, and I think that led to a lot of very productive innovation at the municipal level. So it's not rigid rules; it's just that enabling environment. I think that's important, and I think that's something that in unitary systems that the national government has to do.
Well, don't leave yet, because David has something to announce. And I want to, when I mentioned his name, he's so popular that you gave him a big, big hand. And I said something under my breath, and then I was checking with my friends. I said, we didn't hear it. Because behind him, there is a person that so much as we depend on David depends on Samantha Bremerkamp. That you have to, it's a pleasure. So thank you very much. And now we have turn the floor to David.
Samantha, come on.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate it. It's been too long that we haven't celebrated an anniversary. It's been 20 years. I can assure you it will not be another 20 years before we celebrate again. If I have it my way, we'll celebrate next year as well. So I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the evening and come back many, many more times. And that we'll be able to see all of you many times again. Now, Samantha has a great surprise. She came up with this idea, and we have been collecting name cards, your business cards, in order to do a drawing for, what are we giving away? A Kindle Fire. And I think that the youngest person here is going to help us, Mr. Gali. Oh my goodness. Where is she? The winner is Kareem Giggler. Oh, there she is. Enjoy, Kareem. Well, thank you all once again for coming. I hope we get to do this many more times, and have a good night.